Hi everybody, welcome to week 10 of Combating Consensus. This week in this space we're going to look at 3 games where I think that the public opinion has it on the wrong side of the ledger, where they're backing the wrong team. I'll try to rationalize why my pick is on the other side of that contest, and we'll see what you think of that, and we'll see what the tail says on Monday morning. Now, last week's Monday, the tail wasn't really in our favor. We were 0 for 3 last week. But if it counts for anything, I learned a lesson in establishing that record, and it's not to pick a team based on what I think a team should do or what I think that the matchup shows me, but on what they've done in the past, what they're really likely to do on the game, not what they should do. Not suggesting that I'm a better play caller than either Andy Reid or Jason Garrett, but I'm not the only person to have registered my confusion with a few of the in-game decisions that those guys made last week and really on the season. LaShawn McCoy last week, for what it's worth, was ripping it up against the Saints. I predicted him to get a lot of touches and to really carry the Eagles' offense, and he was very good for them inside the 20s, but he didn't get any work in goal-to-go situations, and of course we know by now that they went 0 for 4 in those situations. He had a couple of catches, one of them on a shovel pass, the other on kind of a halfback out route, but no carries inside the 10, despite the fact that he was averaging better than 6 yards a carry. And then for the Dallas Cowboys, we know that through the week, Tony Romo talked a lot about his desire to see the Cowboys play like they were losing all game and play call like they were losing. That means a little more hurry up. It probably means a couple more looks to Jason Witten. Romo called for that. The Cowboys just didn't give it to him last week on the one drive that they did when they were actually losing. They scored a touchdown. They're only one of the game, and they looked pretty good, but they turned to it too late and couldn't get it done against the Falcons last week. So we were 0 for 2 on those games. We were also on the wrong side of Doug Martin's thrashing of the Raiders. I won't try to justify that pick, but I will say that Carson Palmer played pretty well at home, just not good enough to overcome the 40-plus points that the Bucs hung on them. So the first game that I want to take a look at today is the Detroit Lions going on the road to take on the Minnesota Vikings. We got 51% of the public picking the Lions to win this game, and that's the side that we're on, but it's essentially a pick-em proposition, and it's shocking me. I'm surprised to see the Lions with just 51% of the public opinion here. They're playing a Vikings team with a quarterback who's thrown for less than 65 yards in 2 of his last 3 games. It's not a very good number, but it's pretty indicative of how Christian Ponder and the Minnesota Vikings offense are playing. This, of course, was compiled while he had his best receiver in the lineup. This week, Percy Harvin looks very doubtful. In fact, he's got the doubtful designation, and even though he's saying today that he wants to get on the field, I somehow don't see it. And even if he does, he's at less than 100%, so he's less of a threat. He'll be missed. Jerome Simpson isn't going to replace him, that's for sure. And again, Christian Ponder's had trouble picking up the yardage even when he can throw to a guy like Harvin, so I just don't see him getting it done against the Lions this week. Adrian Peterson's been bringing it all season, particularly at home, and he's going to continue to do that, but hasn't been enough to help Ponder out in recent weeks. And again, even if he rushes for, let's say, 130 yards, a couple scores, might be all the offense we see out of the Vikings in this one. Now, the Lions were beaten on their home turf by Minnesota earlier this season, but they did that in a game where they scored 2 special teams touchdowns. In fact, it was after a week where Detroit had let up, I think, 3 special teams or 2 in a defensive score against Tennessee. So it was at a time when they were really struggling, and they fixed that unit. Minnesota's coaching staff even acknowledged that this week. So they're not going to get 14 freebie points against the Lions this week either. And that's what they needed to beat them the last time out. Calvin Johnson's, of course, he's hurting a little bit. We could argue to what degree he's actually injured. He tells us he has a concussion. He tells us he's sustained nerve damage. Then he changes his mind, says he misspoke. What he realizes is that he put his team in a bad situation, and someone told him to correct himself. Either way, not at 100%. He's missed a bunch of practice time the last 2 weeks, but he missed it entirely in week 9, and then he went out and caught 7 balls for $130. So he's still going to be able to contribute for the Vikings. I'm not too worried about Calvin Johnson in this one. What I should point out now, and we're going to look at this a little bit more this week, is that third down efficiency actually quite a bit favors Detroit in this one. They're about 5% better than the Vikings at getting off the field on third down, which is a stat that probably surprises most of us who just listen to the commentary instead of looking at those key situations, things like that. Minnesota's supposed to have the better defense, but they're not as good at getting off the field on third down. And in fact, Detroit's secondary that's kind of cobbled together right now has been holding it together pretty well for them, and I think that they'll continue to do that again against a weak passing attack in Minnesota. They're also converting a lot of their third downs. In fact, over the past 3 games, they have the best mark in the league in this area at over 55%, while Minnesota has been second worst during that same time frame. With that stat, I really don't think that there's a lot more they have to say. Minnesota's getting the ball, moving the chain successfully on third down about half the time as Detroit over their last 3 games, 27.7%, or 27.2%, pardon me. That's not enough to beat the Lions, despite what we think of their defense. I think Detroit really takes it to Minnesota in this one, and I'm surprised to see the public making a pick otherwise. Gonna move on to a couple more complicated games now. This one, I feel like I'm putting myself out on a limb. We've seen a couple picks, and I've been on this limb a couple of times already this season. In fact, in 2 consecutive weeks, and I've been wrong. So I'm hoping that the Saints don't leave me hanging, but I'm taking them to beat the Atlanta Falcons with about 62% of the public feeling otherwise. It's the first time in 2 seasons that New Orleans has not been favored in a home game, which is it's an interesting stat if nothing else, and of course they deserve it. New Orleans, not so great so far this season. They've struggled quite a bit. Atlanta's 8-0, so you can see where the bookmakers are making their decision there. Again, marks 2 years that we've seen that. It marks 3 weeks in a row that I've picked against Atlanta, but I'm hoping that this is where the contest, where it turns around. Last week's Saints team certainly looked like they had turned around. Of course, the quality of opponent there was on a different scale than it will be this week against Atlanta, but they looked like the old Saints. Atlanta has historically struggled against New Orleans, that old Saints team. They've won about 5 or 6 against Matt Ryan here over the last 3 years, and they've won 3 straight as well. Things, of course, have changed in Atlanta this year. I wrote an article this week about the success that Dirk Cutter has had on offense, and it focused less on what Mike Nolan was doing on defense, but he's making an improvement in that unit as well. So definitely a different team, definitely different schemes to prepare for, but I still think that we have to take that history into consideration in a divisional matchup. Again, last week, New Orleans finally showed some signs of turning it around on defense. They did still give up a ton of yardage. They were still easy to run on, but the pressure they were able to put on Michael Vick allowed them to get to the quarterback, to take Philadelphia out of some key scoring situations. And while I know that the offensive line is a bit stronger in Atlanta, bit being an understatement there, I think that they'll still be able to get some pressure to get Matt Ryan off his game a little bit, and I think it's going to help. I think they're figuring out Steve Spagnuolo's defense, and more importantly perhaps, Steve Spagnuolo is adjusting to the players that he has on the Saints and finding out how to get them to fit the scheme. So I think that they showed us a few things last week, and I'm hoping that with this pick, they'll continue to show us a few things. Lastly, a lot of the focus has really been on assigning too much credit to the Saints for a win over an inferior opponent last week. But I've said this a couple of times in recent weeks, and again, I've been wrong, but Atlanta's beaten just one opponent over 500 this season, one quality victory. They looked pretty bad against a Dallas team last week that just failed to get it going on offense. Otherwise, it's a loss for Atlanta, and we could have said that a couple of times in recent weeks. I think this week, New Orleans is the team that's able to take advantage of the opportunities that Atlanta is still giving opponents to beat them. That's why I'm picking the Saints this week. Going to move on now to really the most difficult game of the week to pick. It's going to be an exciting one. It may even be a potential Super Bowl matchup. So should be a lot of fun on Sunday night watching the Texans take on the Bears. Again, because these two teams are pretty evenly matched, they both come in at 7-1, and they're probably the class of their respective conferences. it's tough to pick. We've got 54% of the public on Chicago. I'm going on the other side, and I'll admit that I've even flip-flopped a little bit in this game. There are a lot of things going into Chicago's favor here. It's on their home field. It's supposed to be pretty cold, might affect Houston that way. And a lot of people have talked this week about how Jay Cutler's fourth quarter numbers are impressive. He's got 8 passing touchdowns in that quarter on the season. He can really turn it on when he needs to. Matt Schaub's less impressive. The reality is he just hasn't had to pass a whole lot in the fourth quarter. Can't hold that against him, but in a game that we're assuming will be pretty close and they might need some fourth quarter offense, it's interesting to note that Jay Cutler has the advantage over Matt Schaub there, at least to this point this season. Another thing, according to coldhardfootballfacts.com, Chicago has what they call the most bendable defense in the league. What that is they give up the most yards per point. It's a measure of efficiency. They can get away with giving yards in the middle of the field, but they're very effective at turning the ball over, as we know, and it's stopping opponents in the red zone. So that's definitely worth noting, especially because this is unlikely to be a high-scoring game, so that stat could serve them well when it comes to the fourth quarter again, when yards have been hard to come by. They're really fighting to move the ball down the field. If Chicago's bend but don't break defense can step up, they might get a key stop when they need it. But there are a lot of stats in Houston's favor as well. Number one, they're better on third down offense and defense, and Chicago's trending pretty high in the last 3 weeks on the third down conversions that they've allowed to opponents, and it's not like they've faced very good opponents either. That's the Panthers, that's the Jags, and a couple of blowout games. So it's worth noting that they're trending downward on offensive and defensive conversions over the same time frame. Really, again, it's an evenly matched game, but I like Houston's offensive line to hold up a lot better than I like Chicago's. Of course, the defensive line in Houston has been doing great things this season. We got a couple of potential Defensive Player of the Year candidates in this matchup, one of them being Peanut Tillman, who's going to continue to play great for Chicago's defense, the other being J.J. Watt on Houston's line, and he's got a better matchup in this one. Chicago's kind of always been characterized as having that turnstile offensive line, and they've been in and out of that this season. They've had stretches where they look pretty good, but I think in this game they're going to continue to look bad. As well, Houston has a really strong secondary, again, much like Chicago, but I think Houston's deep enough that they can look some other directions, involve Owen Daniels, working in Arian Foster as a pass catcher, look at Kevin Walter over the middle, guys like that, even Casey, who they've involved in recent weeks. Chicago really is Brandon Marshall in the passing game. I think it's fantastic. I think Marshall's doing a great job this season. It shows what a good move it was bringing him in to reunite with Jay Cutler, but in this game I think it's a problem because the Texans have Jonathan Joseph and a really strong secondary that can either double cover or match up well enough one-on-one against Brandon Marshall to try and negate his impact on this game. He's still going to catch some balls, Cutler's still going to go his way, but I think that he will be less valuable in this one than, say, his 3-touchdown performance last week. And I think that affects Chicago because they don't really have anyone else to catch the ball behind him, particularly with Alshon Jeffrey still on the shelf in this game. Really comes down to the turnover battle. Chicago's been winning that this season, but given that Houston has been very good at protecting the ball, they're a top 6, I think, offense in not turning the ball over, they'll be less prone to do that against Chicago than some of the other opponents that they feasted on this season. I think that's what ends up making the difference in this game. Less opportunities for Chicago's defense to actually put points on the board against Houston. I also like the third down conversion stat. I just like the way Houston comes into this game ready to roll. And I think that they're going to do enough to take down the Bears this week and move to 8-1. So those are my picks this week. We're taking the Texans over the Bears, the Saints over the Falcons, and the Lions over the Vikings. 1 home team, 2 road teams. Not how I like to do things when I'm putting myself out there publicly, but those are the matchups that we got this week. I like them to help us fix our record, get things back on the winning track. So thanks for checking us out. Love to hear your comments, where you're standing on the games, and we'll see how it goes on the field this week. Thank you.